Welcome back. Welcome back to the Sikistan Center for Dissemination and Insemination of Information. We are following on another part 2 this week from our recent video where we did the 7 deadly sins of combat sports, MMA, strength and conditioning, where we looked at Stephen Wonderboy Thompson's training. I was going to say workout there, but I hate saying the word workout. So what we're going to do is, there's a couple of comments and a couple of questions, which are some good questions that we're going to run through, and we're going to answer those. Instead of just typing back and answer that person, more people get more value out of it if we do that fitness thing where you talk with your hands instead of just typing them an answer.
So up first, we have Mac Evo Style, and he's asking about the difference between machine weights versus barbell weights in relation to the difference between physio and training. So I suppose there's two different issues there. The first one is like using machines versus using free weights. Both of them are valid training methods. They both have their own kind of applications. For most, if you were to put a blanket statement over it, for most athletic populations, you will almost never be using machines except for some very selective isolation accessory work. The majority of your resistance training will be done using free weights. So the example of this would be squatting, benching, pressing, rowing, pulling from the floor. All of this will be done using barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, whatever it is. There's a few advantages to that. So first, you're not only able to load much more significantly and much more incrementally using a barbell or a dumbbell or a kettlebell, but you're also doing things like increasing proprioceptive awareness. You're able to put a lot more power into the bar a lot of the time. So a lot of the time, if we're using a cable machine or some sort of resistance training machine, we're not going to be able to really be explosive while using the machine. A lot of the time we're focusing on kind of long, drawn out, slow and controlled contractions versus a much more kind of athletic style of movement when you would be doing a barbell back squat or a power clean or a deadlift or something along those lines. There's also added advantage to using a free weight for an athlete. So if an athlete is used to accommodating some sort of load, so if they're used to catching a barbell, sitting down with the squat, their eccentric loading is going to be much, much higher than if they're just doing a machine where they're kind of, so the eccentric loading is lengthening of muscle tissue under tension. That's where we get most kind of hypertrophy effect. It's where we get a lot of the fatigue kind of associated with lifting as well. But that particular portion of the lift is much, much higher when you're using free weights due to the fact that you're having to control the path the weight is descending in. So if I'm doing a squat on a hack squat machine or a Smith machine, it's very, very easy for me just to sit straight down because the barbell is being controlled laterally and side to side. Front to back and side to side. When I'm sitting down with a barbell on my back, there's an awful lot more work to do, so it's a much higher training effect is gleaned from it.
Usually where you would really see the use for machine weights is in general is just hypertrophy training. That kind of fits out there. They are nice to have, but certainly not a necessary to have in terms of performance or S&C work. So if you have access to them and you have a specific area you want to target, then isolating with machines can be very, very useful, but it's just that one particular case. So machines are very, very good at what they do, and that is just isolating particular muscles, not really movements per se, and just focusing in on those. And when you need to use them for that, it's very, very useful. Like single leg curls, for example, very, very easy to do on a leg machine or leg curl machine. So much harder to set up properly in other areas. Rear delt flies, lat pull down, stuff like that. There's stuff you almost can't set up outside of a machine setting, or if you can, it's very, very difficult, and it's very, very difficult to load it correctly and keep it consistent, and the hassle of setting it up. So machines are useful for very specific scenarios, but then you miss out on all the other benefits of using, I suppose, free weights, which we just call training, not free weights.
The second part to that question then of like the difference between physio and actual training is very, very simple. Usually physio work or like prehabilitation work or rehabilitation work is just getting you to the point where you're no longer injured or to the point where you're less likely to be re-injured again. So a lot of fighters will have the shoulder issues, the knee issues, hip issues that are kind of associated with high impact sport or high contact levels in sport. Most physio work is just prehab. Even if you haven't been injured, you can usually see the kind of modalities of injuries that pop up very frequently if you have a fighter coming into your physiotherapy practice, you know that fighter is probably going to have X, Y, and Z injury, or they're predisposed to having those more likely. So you would hit them up with a certain amount of kind of bulletproofing or a certain amount of assistance work that is going to make them much more resistant to getting injured. Everything else you do is training. I've seen this kind of term thrown around before, where you have like a physio's deadlift, where everything is flat, the neck is fully stacked in, the weight is fully flat on the feet. It's a very slow and controlled movement, and that's kind of what you'd associate with rehabilitation exercise, or the rehabilitation of the posterior chain using the deadlift, and versus a deadlift of a powerlifter or a deadlift of a weightlifter, where they're very, very much focused on lifting the most amount of weight off the floor, or in the case of the weightlifter, lifting the weight off the floor in the correct motor pattern as quickly as possible or with the correct tempo. So that is the kind of difference. For most athletes, you're never worried about the physio stuff too much. You will know when you have to do it, and you'll be told what you will have to do. You're really worried about the performance aspect, because that's what makes you better at being an athlete and makes you better at your sport.
Next up, we have a question from Adam. Adam says, is there a specific time and place for instability training? A personal example would be ring dips, which feel great for me in terms of muscle recruitment and being an effective training tool. However, for a fighter who's experienced with them, would stable dips still be better for GPP due to better force production potential? When it comes to single leg stability, there's obviously a benefit in training them for being generally better functioning person, and that's learning to stabilize from a less stable condition. So, as you alluded to, there's certainly benefit to some level of stability, or else we'd all be using purely machines for S&C. So that is a extrapolation of what we're saying in the wrong understanding, in the wrong direction. So you're using terms that are, you've kind of misused terms there, or you're kind of conceptualizing certain kinds of training. So when we talk about, so just get to the kind of instability training, and this kind of covers your ring dip part as well. When we talk about stability training, what we're really doing is making sure you're in an environment where you're currently stable, and then you put yourself just enough away from that environment where you have to stabilize a certain joint or through a certain movement. When we talk about instability training being useless, we're talking, and with the research, we're talking about being on an unstable surface or in an unstable platform, or rings, for example, another example of an unstable training tool, where they are, no matter realistically how stable you are, you're not going to be able to stabilize those in any meaningful scenario. And then if you can, you're not going to be able to train those in enough reps or load them enough where you'll get some meaningful loading. For example, back squatting 40 kilos on a Bosu ball doesn't suddenly make 40 kilo back squats more effective for you if your best back squat is 250 kilos. And there are no circumstance will a 40 kilo back squat be ever useful for you. And in that same way, no circumstance will a bodyweight squat on a Bosu ball be any more effective for you. So realistically, where we saw ring dips come from, so as a tool, was just a lot of CrossFitter gyms had those. Obviously, gymnasts did them far before CrossFit, but we saw them, come into the kind of general population. If you saw stuff like TRX straps or whatever you call them. So there's a difference between being on an unstable surface and calling that instability training, and then doing stuff like single leg work, which is still putting you on a very same stable surface, but your coordination is the issue here. So there's different aspects of how you get stronger. So there's a variety of those, and we've talked about them in a load of different videos. Some of them is like coordination is one of those, so the actual quality of control over the movements. Sometimes people kind of think of coordination as more, can you tie your lace or can you juggle? But when we're talking about coordination of movements, it's how much finesse and how much familiarity your body has with a particular movement. So coordination is something that develops over years. So you can learn to do a back squat in 15 minutes, and it can take 15 years to perfect a back squat. So there's different levels of coordination. So when you're talking about coordination, for example, in your single leg work here, you're really talking about coordination rather than instability training. You have poor coordination with that exercise. It's not putting you on an unstable surface. It's putting you in an environment where you're just not very good at that movement, okay? So it's not really the same thing to call it instability training. Yes, you might look unstable, but that is a different version. It's a different use of language. And then there's particular language in sports science that we use when we're talking about specific scenarios, and then there is words we use that still work well when we're talking about them in the general English language, and that's probably where this kind of idea of instability training with single leg stuff compared to instability training on a bosu ball.
It's important to note as well that like certain areas you're going to very, very frequently have a high demand on your level of coordination, proprioception, stability, whatever you want to refer to it as, right? If we bundle all those into the same silo, the use of ring dips, and I don't by any means stray away from them. A lot of athletes I have do ring dips for different reasons. Most of them do them because they're CrossFitters and they have to do CrossFit style movements. The use of ring dips for an S&C, for an MMA fighter, is quite questionable, right? So why firstly would you be using a dip, right? If you just look at the actual exercise itself, why would you be doing it? You're probably looking to build some sort of extensor strength in the arm, so locking out your elbow more forcefully is probably what you're trying to do. You might also be trying to build some shoulder strength, so in order for a fighter to be able to maintain good posture, this kind of movement is probably quite good. The dip is usually kind of recommended as we're pushing towards external rotation or trying to force more external rotation in the shoulders, particularly if we're doing it quite strict with external rotation of the elbows at the top of the dip. It can be quite good posturally. So that's why we might be doing dips. We're not just doing it because we want bigger arms, we're doing it because we want to be able to lock out our arms better, we want to have stronger shoulders, we want to be less inclined to be injured, we want to have better posture. Then we need to look at what prerequisites would be useful to use for a dip. So, granted, no fighter is going to think they need to do 150 dips unbroken for 5 sets. That's just, nobody thinks they're going to need to do that. Realistically, no athlete needs to do that. In the same way, a fighter would probably be very worried if they can't do more than 5x5 on a set of normal bar dips or ring dips, right? If you can't do 5x5 and you're a fairly high level MMA fighter, there's definitely something wrong there. So what we have to look at is there's a level of force we need to be able to produce. What's that level of force? Well, it's probably 5x8 or 5x12 or something like that, a moderately high level of volume, and we're using body weight most of the time with the dip. We see a lot of fighters will weight dips, so they obviously want a higher level of force production, and then that brings us on to what modality or what level of dips do we want to get to. Are we going to be more effective making someone stronger, so with less relative fatigue, so doing normal bar dips on a set of parallel bars in a gymnastics gym will make you less fatigued than a set of ring dips will make you? So do we need to make them stronger and able to do more reps and more sets in a less fatiguing environment? Or do we need to make it really difficult, possibly sacrifice their ability to do the requisite amount of sets and reps, and make them less effective at producing large amounts of force in extending the elbow and making their shoulders strong? It comes down to like no exercise is good or bad. It's the application of that exercise in a certain case is what will make it good or bad. And probably for fighters, like, when do you ever need to be stable in this position? Very, very rarely, right? It's not even shoulder stability, because your lats tend to pull your shoulders in so much, and your shoulders tend to stack around your midsection so much when you're at the top of a dip, which is where most of the stability work is done when we pause here for a sec. That is so unrelated to everything you're doing. It's probably not even, like, it's probably just fatiguing your T-spine and your mid-spine, right? That's probably what's going on there. You're probably getting a small bit more recruitment of anterior musculature in the midsection, but you're probably a lot better off to just be using static bars, like ideally a set of parallel bars or bull bars coming out from a squat rack, and do the right amount of sets for the right amount of reps, and actually getting stronger and adding weight and being able to move that weight faster, produce more power, and be a better athlete overall, rather than making things more niche, more difficult, less stable, and then less applied to our sport itself.
So I can talk for a while now.
That's what I was saying.
Yeah, let me talk for a while.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ. So there is another. Fuck, now I forgot what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So you just bulldog in as usual. They never get to see this now, but see how much of a bully you are. One quick comment as well on the single leg stuff. It's just the example you used. So you're saying when it kind of comes from other benefits from it. A lot of the benefit from single leg stuff doesn't really come from that balance aspect. Usually what it comes from is a discrepancy in a person's ability to apply force through either legs. So athletes are always one side a little bit more dominant than the other. They'll either apply more force to one side and have better coordination to one side, or favour another side due to injury or just to develop momentum. No athlete is bilaterally like fully symmetrical. This just doesn't happen. There's huge discrepancies even among elite athletes. So a lot of time the benefits you'll see, for example, from single leg stuff won't come from a person, say if we do single leg RDLs or Bulgarian split squats. They don't get a lot of benefit from balancing themselves. That balance will come after like 2 or 3 sessions of that, and then they've got to function. What it usually comes from is that athlete learning how to apply more force, kind of remapping that leg or that weaker leg onto their kind of central nervous system, and their ability to apply force to their legs individually then accommodates them then as they kind of do their bilateral stuff. So you get more comfortable and you get more used to applying force to either one of those legs at one at a time, because when you do them bilateral movements, you get used to applying the force and how those favourable actions and how your whole body coordination happens. You end up kind of getting a little bit of discrepancy towards one side and never really addressing it. So the real benefits come from single leg stuff is that you just get a chance to kind of have a little bit of alone time with that opposing leg, the weaker leg. You get a little bit of a chance to apply more force and get better coordination with that leg, and you get a chance to kind of bring that up from its deficit. The other part then for Adam's question is, for example, would single leg balancing drills with distractions be good or a bad balance exercise for a fighter? It may help strengthen foot muscles and work on more stable surface than Bosu ball fighting. Bosu balls, but fighting is pretty much never done in a static position on your feet. So there's kind of that issue again with the but fighting is pretty much never done in a static position on your feet. So there's that kind of idea that we should be replicating our sport in the gym. But I would try to get away from that idea that you're trying to replicate your sport in the gym as much as possible, and start thinking about yourself as a kind of like a character in a role-playing game or a video game. Think if you have different traits that you need to bring up. If you think about your force production, your velocity, your conditioning, or your aerobic capacity, your skill development, and again, think about these individually. So the better all of these get, the better you'll be able to get then in any scenario and apply these across those. So like we were talking about last week, if you try and make everything better at one time, you just won't be able to get better. Nothing will get better in any meaningful rate in your training. Whereas if you focus on these individually, once these are quite high, your body is very, very adaptable, very, very smart, and will be able to apply these new attributes or raised attributes in different scenarios when you go do play your sport. And we know this to be true because this is how S&C has been working for the last 100 odd years, and it's been working very well for people. So we know this is the case for athletes. It's not a new development. It's something that recurs periodically, and we see it a lot, especially with the advent of social media, where people talk about replicating their sport in the gym as much as possible. You see people doing stuff like weighted rows that mimic the pull of an archery bow for archers, and you see weighted implements in the gym, and there's a whole host of evidence to show that that is detrimental to skill development. And the same way it would be for swinging a weighted baseball bat. Doing stuff like replicating your movements in the gym as a fighter would only detrimentally affect those.
James Nichols then had a point, right? So he said, loves the stuff brought up in the video, but he disagrees with, we basically said in the last video, you shouldn't be using ladders and doing speed and agility work when you're fatigued. And he said, but ladder work and foot drills at the end of a session when tired are essential, in my honest opinion. They're an essential part of martial arts. Could be the difference between closing out a points win and getting caught at the end of a fight. Knowing you can move well into a state, or when in a tired state, is advantageous. This is the crux of the entire issue. This is like issue number one with terrible MMA fighting or terrible MMA strength and conditioning work. You don't need to make everything into this is what happens in a fight. Like Owen just said, when you're training speed and agility work, you're training speed and agility work to make you better at speed and better at agility. You don't suddenly say, I'm going to do squats on a barbell and then I'm going to keep punching you in the face so you're better at being knocked out. That makes no sense. When you're doing strength training, you are doing strength training. When you're doing speed and agility work, you do speed and agility work. When you're doing recovery work, you're doing recovery work. It's important to note that in the particular case of speed and agility work, it should be done as early in the session or as early in the training period as we can possibly make it. So we need to be fresh when we're doing it. We need to make sure all of our movements are as crisp and as fast and as free from fatigue as possible, because if we keep learning slow ladder drills, or if we keep doing ladder drills as we're slow and fatigued, we're just going to imprint a motor pattern which is more slow and more fatigued. And it means even when we're very fresh, we've gone through our cut, we've rehydrated, we feel great going into the ring, and then we come into a fighting environment where you feel very, very well replenished, you feel good, you feel your camp has gone perfect. You then go to move your feet, and you have the motor pattern of somebody who moves their feet like they're really tired. It would be like a sprinter constantly training themselves to sprint slowly, so then if they're tired on the day of a sprint, they know they can sprint slowly. It makes no sense. The last 80 years of strength and conditioning research and human physiology research has told us that in order to get faster, we train faster. In order to make ourselves more agile, we ensure that we're very agile when we're training agility work. You should not be doing it at the end of a session. This does not happen in other sports. We don't get tennis players who suddenly put a bandage around their knee so they can't bend their knee and then force themselves to play a tennis match so they can play a tennis match with one rigid leg. We don't get F1 drivers blocking out one side of their visor so they know they can drive with one eye. You get people training to be better at what they're doing.
So again, if you think about the ingredients that go into being tired or having fresh footwork, if you think about this kind of two components, you have your skill, your ability to move your feet, and then your aerobic conditioning. So that's what makes you tired, is your lack of high quality conditioning towards the end of a fight, or you've run through your resources through that fight, or however long it takes you to get to that fatigue state. So if you think about doing tired footwork drills, this isn't really going to benefit your aerobic conditioning because you're not doing enough aerobic work to bring that attribute up. And as a skill movement for advanced fighters who are fighting, realistically, footwork is something that they're probably well adept at. There's only so many variations of foot movement. It's a very subconscious movement. It's something that they'll practice for a period of time, and then they'll have good coordination with that, and there'll be something that'll be entrenched in their brain, and oftentimes they won't think that a whole lot unless it's a particular weakness for them. So if you think about doing tired footwork drills, it doesn't make sense because it doesn't benefit either attribute of your training when it comes to having quality footwork in a fatigue state. What will benefit you more is separating your footwork into a place where you're fresh, and then doing quality aerobic work, massively bringing up your aerobic and conditioning capacity, whereby you are more resilient to more work. So the further into a fight you get, the more resources you have, or the more of a backup you have, and so that allow you to remain fresher for longer. And your skill of footwork isn't suddenly going to lose you in a fight, or suddenly going to leave you in a fight. You're not going to be able to remember how to do it anymore. It's all based on how much resources you've left in your aerobic conditioning. So if that is quite high, and you keep that high, and you do that separately, because we know footwork drills aren't very aerobically taxing for high level fighters, so it doesn't really make sense to do it in that scenario. Scott Levy, please, says, so if you want to be strong and have good condition, then you can't train it in one day. If I train weightlifting, snatches and squats, etc., and at the end of the workout, kettlebell swings, dumbbell snatches, is it wrong? And I should divide into weightlifting strength day and condition day.
This isn't necessarily a question of like day, right? So it's not really important if you do it on the same day or on the next day. What's really important in like the case of dividing up strength work with conditioning work, with speed work, with power work, whatever it is you need to ensure those kind of resources we have are being effectively divided between the two, right? So there's one kind of rule that we'll run almost all training by, and that's the higher output movements. So sprinting, like the ones that are really far down the force velocity curve, right? So very high velocity movements must be trained first, whether that's speed work, agility work, foot movement drills, really fast barbell movements, sprinting, plyometrics, all of those, they should get training first, right? When we are at our most fresh, we should hit that session. But obviously, we're not just going to be able to do, if we have 3 speed sessions a week or 3 sessions where we need that kind of really high allocation of resources, then we're only left with 4 other training days, and you probably train around 4 days a week anyway in your sports, whether that's MMA or Jiu-Jitsu. So on those cases, you prioritize those high speed, so high velocity movements, they come first. That session might take 45 minutes to an hour and a half. You then ensure you're adequately rested and you can do your conditioning. Adequate rest is the next piece then. So if I'm going to be doing really high velocity power cleans and fast squats, right? So a power production weight room session, the adequate amount of recovery for me before I go into a 3-kilometer row at a very slow pace might be 10 minutes. It might be 5 minutes. It might be 3 minutes and a bottle of orange juice, and then I can get on the rower and do my steady state, low capacity stuff. In the case where you're doing something like this, where it's kettlebell snatches and kettlebell cleans, because you're taxing similar systems, so it's quite taxing on the actual musculature itself, you may need to take a slightly longer break. So it might be something where you do your speed and power stuff earlier on in the day, then you take a number of hours off, and then later on in that evening, you can go and you can do your slightly higher intensity interval training or stuff like that.
Lucas Dubb has a question. He said, I have a question, video idea. I need to prove my grip strength as a limiting factor for many of my lifts exercises. He says when he focuses on it, the quality of RDLs, the pull-ups suffers, for example, but then he obviously wants to keep progressing his movement stuff, so I assume he's using straps. Main thing with grip strength training is you just need to keep the grip training you're doing as specific as possible to what you're trying to improve your grip for. So if you're trying to improve your grip strength for pull-ups and RDLs, that's with a standard barbell, usually something between 28 millimeters and 32 millimeters, so that'll be the barbell or the pull-up bar you're hanging from. So what you do is just do extended bar hangs from the pull-up bar, do them for time, try progress them, do multiple sets, extra time, higher frequency for the RDL, for pulling, stuff like that. What you do is simply just set up a suitcase deadlift, move it away from you, so you do it in a rack, set it up just below your full standing height, you reach down to the side, grip it, stand up, make sure it's not leaning against the side of your leg, and just hold it there without the hook grip and squeeze it for as long as possible. And that's the best grip training you can do. Other stuff then you can do is like less specific grip training. Stuff like towel pull-ups do work quite well sometimes. We generally don't seem to see making grips wider much use for a lot of grip strength, so like fat grips or like really thick ropes. You don't seem to be able to recruit enough muscles in your forearm to really train them adequately for the transfer we're looking for. Whereas you do see the smaller you can make it for some reason in your hand, or as specific as possible. So the widest or the maximum weight you would go is just the weight of the barbell, but then you can go smaller with like smaller ropes or towel pull-ups, stuff like that. Do seem to train the muscles quite well when they can close in closer, but we don't see it go in the opposite direction for grip strength training. Sam says, a lot of your video seems to be arguing for the transfer potential, the transfer principle. See, just when I read this question, it makes it seem like the transfer principle is a novel concept and it's like something we're kind of like on the fringes of, but it's absolutely not. Like the transfer principle is something that's been around for literally decades and decades. Just training, general training makes you better as a general athlete, and then you go play your sport, and then your body transfers these skills into making you better at that sport or improves your quality of sport. This is the thing that's been around for the best S&C coaches understand this. However, a lot of coaches don't understand this, and I don't really understand why combat sports have the biggest deficit compared to other sports. There's lots of bad coaches in lots of the sports, but it just seems to be there's a huge deficit of this up until recently, maybe in terms of MMA, where a lot of coaches don't seem to get this principle. And I'd wonder, is it a lot of them just open gyms and then they move to S&C coaching when they finish fighting, or they just have all their athletes in that one gym and then they have the S&C area, so they're like, okay, I'll just do their S&C as well, because athletes probably wouldn't go to a separate gym and it wouldn't be feasible, I'd imagine.
I think there's an issue that happens in fighting, and it's the insular and inherently combative nature of fighting.
Yes.
So when we have a gym, we tend to be very, very closed in as groups. So if I train at Shark Tank Born Killers MMA gym,
yeah, and if I train at Cold-Blooded Arsonists Kidnapping Kids Jiu-Jitsu gym,
then I'm not going to listen to Cold-Blooded Arsonists, and he's not going to listen to me. And this is why we get, like, there's so many comments about charlatans in MMA, so many comments about, like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, this guy doesn't know what he's doing, because a lot of them don't. And, like, the running joke we have, and this is just a running joke, is that the S&C work for MMA is probably so high due to the incredibly high prevalence of head injuries with MMA coaches, because most of them are MMA fighters or boxers or something. But it is the unfortunate nature that everyone has their own thing. This doesn't happen so much in other sports because we have governing bodies who tend to take over a lot of this stuff. So if you take, for example, rugby in Ireland, the IRFU, which in turn is governed by international rugby, and the information most of the time is disseminated down from international rugby, where you have, this is what we do for S&C for 16-year-olds to 18-year-olds. That is then coached to all coaches of a certain level. All those coaches of all those different clubs get that information at around the same time. Now you get different coaches at different levels, people with different levels of experience, qualifications, all these things weigh into that. But we don't tend to see that as much in MMA, and that's why, like, in some of the questions when people are kind of confused as to there's so many different rhetorics and there's so many different things of like, oh, you think the transfer principle works? Like,
yeah, it's kind of like,
it's like saying, oh, you think linear progression works for training, or you think you should lift heavier weights to get stronger. Like, that's as basic as this is. There's people get really, really tied into like the one specific way of training of like, oh, I just do Ido Portal stuff and I don't lift any weights.
Mm-hmm.
Or
remember when GSP went on Joe Rogan and said he doesn't do any resistance training, but then he goes into a pool and he gets these weights that have channels that resist the flow of water. So he said that's the training he does, but he doesn't do any resistance training.
Even though that is resistance training, you know, like it's a really strange area because it's all like this pigeonhole, and this pigeonhole is incredibly specialized. This one's even more specialized. This one, we're not allowed to eat meat and we don't sleep at night and we do resistance training. It's all these different kind of factions, and that's why I think you get a lot of this kind of strange or this alternative training method where only the Born Killers training method works, or only my training method works, you know.
Or then you'll see things like, you know, someone like Tyson Fury who doesn't seem to do a lot of S&C by the looks of things, or from what we know.
Jesus Christ.
No, but you know, or the gentleman who beat Anthony Joshua. People say, oh look, he doesn't even do S&C, so I just like to do fight training, and that's better, you know. But you're like looking at elite individuals who are talented athletes first, and then they could certainly be better athletes. I'd argue if they had a better S&C implication or program.
Absolutely. Someone asked what qualifications me and you have, Gareth.
I have an undergrad in biochemistry.
And I have an undergrad in sport and exercise science and a master's degree in sports psychology.
Brian wants to know, do you think hang power cleans and straps are dangerous? Yes. And he's saying it's hard beyond 3 reps, and you don't need to do more than 3 reps in hang power cleans because either the weight is too light or you end up getting more conditioning work rather than 3 reps. Nobs has a question. Do you see that one? So
no.
What would you recommend for someone who's doing jiu-jitsu tournaments back to back or multiple tourneys within a couple of months for S&C? Just maintaining the strength they've acquired or focusing on the conditioning and speed work? Thanks. So this is again a problem with not using traditional effective S&C principles in MMA, is that other sports always take an off season and they will take a period of time to build up the reserves of S&C work, so like their force production, their velocity, their aerobic capacity, their muscle mass, their psychological relaxation. They'll take time away from their sport and build up all these things as much as possible. They'll take time off drugs, or they'll take time to take more drugs, and they'll build up all of these things as best they possibly can. So then once they go through their season, they are fighting this kind of decay of performance for the whole season, and then they'll do their season hopefully just long enough whereby they're able to maintain enough S&C to maintain a high level of performance, and then when the season is over, they've hopefully still have enough S&C that they were able to get through it comfortably without injury and still win, and then they go into another off season and build it all back up again and repeat the circus over and over and over
until you finally decide to stop.
Yes.
We actually have a video on what off seasons look like for rugby S&C, and you'll see those kind of building up of the off-season values and then the decay. So if you want more information on that, you can find that on the channel. There's the last one I can find is Raphael, and he said he disagrees with the shoe selection or shoe suggestion. Where Wonder Boy was doing power cleans in his bare feet, and we were talking about the ineffective nature of power cleans, or to be honest, most resistance training, bare deadlifts in your bare feet. So he said, you want to train your feet all the time for MMA. That power clean has most correspondence with a 50-50 wrestling position. So for Wonderboy as a striker, it's even more important for him to train with his shoes off, as he's typically the weaker guy in the cage and needs to train his balance while stuffing takedowns. When we're doing power cleans, we want to do really good power cleans. We want the most effective weight on the bar in terms of power production. That's going to be somewhere between 60 and 80% of 1RM for most people. We want to make sure we're moving fast. We want to make sure we're moving crisply. We want to make sure that motor pattern is safe, effective, and efficient. So we're getting the right muscles being used. We're catching the barbell and really steadying that barbell when we catch it with the correct muscles. We're not putting any extra strain on certain tendons, certain bone structures, certain muscle structures. And then we also want to make sure we can train and progress that lift over the course of multiple weeks and months so it gradually gets stronger and more powerful. When we keep training on our feet, catching the barbell, rocking back on our heels as we've seen in this case, what you're doing is you're putting a hell of a lot of stress firstly on the foot itself. So when we impact the ground via a heel strike or even via a flat foot strike, we're getting a huge amount of impact with that fascia that wraps underneath the sole of our foot and comes up into our Achilles tendon, right? So it's something we never ever want to do. The other thing that happens when that happens is we get very, very, very instantaneous negative feedback going through our peripheral nervous system into our central nervous system that says, fuck no, don't do that again. If I stand in front of this wall and punch it as hard as possible, no matter how hard I try, or no matter how much of a born killer I am, I will not be able to punch that wall as hard as I possibly want the second time. Because after the first impact, I will have so much negative feedback feeding through my brain, I'll probably stand in front of the wall and start crying and not be able to do it. This is happening every single time you do a power clean in your bare feet. Particularly a power clean with this kind of form in your bare feet, where it's not ideal. You're going to end up using less weight, you're going to move the bar slower, you're going to move the bar into incorrect positions, and you're not going to get half or a third of the training effect that you would if you just wore a pair of weightlifting shoes and did it on a weightlifting platform. When you train, so somebody F-tier physique afterwards made the great suggestion of training power cleans with power clean shoes on and then training wrestling positions with the wrestling positions.
So I think that's kind of the bulk of them. Thanks for everyone for leaving your comments. If you have other questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below and we'll do a third iteration of this video or a second part of this one. And we really appreciate the cordialness of the vast majority of the commenters, which is great, because we've done other MMA stuff sometimes where the commenters haven't been. That was boxing, to be fair, it wasn't MMA, so I think there might be a discrepancy between fans. There's certainly different there's certainly segregation between other combat sports and boxing fans. Typically you do see boxing fans are very, very confident and often unathletic, untrained, and not boxers.
Jesus Christ.
Whereas we do see a lot of combat sports, MMA, wrestlers, judo, are people who practice the sport themselves and do want to get better, so they're more open-minded, which is great to see. Not to attack any boxing people watching this, just in case. But appreciate that. If you're looking for a strength training program for combat sports, MMA, boxing, jiu-jitsu, whatever, we have a 10-week program. It's 4 sessions a week. If you give it your off season, it'll be phenomenal. If you do it in lead up to your camp, it will work very well. It's 6 weeks of just straight up strength training. It'll make you a born killer, and then we 4 weeks of a bit more dedicated power work. So if you do it in the lead up to a fight, it should put you in a great condition, and it'd be really interesting to hear people's results in it as well. We won't lead you astray. It's good old basic strength training that works, and there's no transfer principle, because it's just transfer principle.